So let's cut to the chase already, okay? You've read the title of this video. Did I like this novel? Not really. Should that mean anything to you? I highly doubt it. And I'm going to tell you why. Hey everybody, welcome back to It's Too Late to Apologize Book Reviews. I'm Stella, and today we're going to be talking about A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man by James Joyce. A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man was written by the Irish author James Joyce and was serialized in 1914. It's a Bildungsroman, or a coming-of-age story, but could also be called a modernist Künstlerroman, which is a portrayal of the development of an artist. This book starts off with one of Stephen's first memories as a young child of about 3 years old. He remembers his father and a nursery song and some sensory awareness of his world. The story moves forward in time to when he's about 6 years old and being bullied in a Jesuit boarding school. First, he's pushed into a ditch or cesspool, which is like a septic tank, by a fellow student. After which he becomes ill and fantasizes about his own death being a punishment for those who bullied him. On a trip home for Christmas, he is surrounded by family and friends, and for once is included at the adult table and witnesses the political and religious conflict he doesn't fully understand divide all the people he loves and knows. Back at school, he accidentally breaks his glasses, which because of his poor eyesight leaves him incapable of doing his schoolwork. He is excused from his work, but a cruel prefect of studies humiliates and physically punishes Stephen in front of the entire class. After some encouragement from his friends, he goes to the rector to tell on the prefect of studies and receives some vindication for his ill treatment. Stephen feels as if this is a win against some of the injustices he has faced in his young life. As he gets a bit older, he must change schools to a less respected Jesuit day school because of his family's money problems, which are ascribed to his father's alcoholism and poor financial decisions. He travels to Cork with his father to sell the remainder of his land at auction. And while visiting his father's old school, Stephen realizes that his inner lustful thoughts are not unique to him, but that many boys go through it. He also realizes that the triumph he felt after informing the rector of the prefect's treatment of him was relayed to his father, and all the adults involved had a laugh about it. Stephen is mortified and feels defeated, and that there's little justice to be had, if any. Stephen continues his studies, becoming an award-winning essay writer, as well as excelling in acting in his school play. But his loneliness and carnal cravings drive him to find respite in a prostitute. After indulging himself for some time with such bodily pleasures, he attends a spiritual retreat that exposes his immoral behavior to his conscience, and he feels terrible regret and guilt. He goes to confession and commits himself to a life of holy devotion. This prolonged dedication is noticed by the director of the school, who tries to persuade him into entering the priesthood. This prospect is both flattering and interesting to Stephen as he contemplates the noble calling, but also the possible power within it. In the end, he decides his nature is not suited to the religious vocation. He instead decides to enroll in university to ultimately pursue an artist's life. The reader sees Stephen grapple with the aesthetic ideals and how politics and religion can cloud artistic expression, but also artistic interpretation. He goes to the beach and sees a girl wading in the sea, and she triggers an epiphany about the manner in which he wishes to experience life. She is beauty, freedom, and contented solitude personified. It doesn't matter what her relationship to the human world is, be it religion, politics, or patriotism, because her simple existence and relation to the natural world, this moment of quiet harmony, is what speaks to Stephen's soul. And he realizes to embody all these things that he must leave his country, religion, and family behind for the opportunity to live unfettered and in the manner he desires for himself. Now, I think a lot of people get caught up in the idea that this novel is about Joyce's life, and there are a lot of overlapping events that take place in both Stephen and James's lives. The same schools, the same events, similar circumstances with his family. So it is a lot about Joyce's life. It is semi-autobiographical, but there are differences. I always choose to separate the artist from his work. So my thoughts are going to be about Stephen. and not about James, just to be clear. Now, what is beautifully displayed in this novel is the struggle to understand a world that refuses to be understood and who refuses to understand you, to not be persuaded into doing and following what one does not believe. There is a level of suffocating isolation you feel for Stephen in this novel, which is well done. The internal debate of the religious world of Protestants, Catholics, and secular life. The political world of nationalism, imperialism, and globalism. But also the social world of family, friendship, idols, and love. The exploration of faith being a starvation of the physical body for the fortification of the soul. And on the other hand, the nourishment of the physical wants leading to the starvation of the soul and a death of the creativity and drive that resides there. This is about how the artist strives to find the balance between these two opposing views. And it's really well done in this novel to see the starvation of the body when purely looked upon from a religious viewpoint, and how the purity of that life can be seen to rob the joy and beauty from one's life for Stephen. On the opposite side of that argument, to fall to the pleasures of the body, hedonistic pleasure, robs one of their internal creativity and essentially artistic expression. It's fantastically illustrated in this novel. This is, again, about how the artist strives to find the balance between these two opposing views. And for some artists, it's not about balance at all, but about fully embracing one extreme or the other, as I talked about in my Siddhartha review. The argument between moralism and aestheticism, also known as autonomism. In that video, I refer to it as moralism versus aesthetics. But aesthetics is a way or set of principles used to appreciate beauty, art, and artistic taste. One's personal aesthetics is the scale or unit of measurement one judges art and beauty with. And how your personal scale is calibrated is based on where you stand on the moralistic autonomism scale. You feel me? This novel did a great job of exploring how Stephen finds his personal aesthetic taste, and you see it change and develop throughout the novel. As he ages, his tastes mature and refine. The writing style changes to capture this. And that chapter with the fire and brimstone sermon is one of the most potent psychological religious beatdowns I have ever experienced in my life. Like, damn. Oh. Like this is a really long section, so I don't know how much of it I'm going to read. But so Stephen goes to this religious retreat, and he's been enjoying some cardinal sins. He's been visiting some prostitutes and indulging, let's just say. And so he goes to this religious retreat, and this is the sermon he receives there. And dark smoke of burning brimstone, amid which the bodies are heaped, one upon another, without even a glimpse of air. All of the plagues with which the land of the Pharaohs was smitten, one plague alone, that of darkness, was called horrible. What name, then, shall we give to the darkness of hell, which is to last not for 3 days alone, but for all eternity? The horror of this strait and dark prison is increased by its awful stench. All the filth of the world, all the offal and scum of the world, we are told, shall run there, as to a vast reeking sewer, when the terrible conflagration of the last has purged the world. The brimstone, too, which burns there in such prodigious quantity, fills all hell with its intolerable stench, and the bodies of the damned themselves exhale such a pestilential odor that, as Saint Bonaventure said, one of them alone would suffice to infect the whole world. The very air of this world, that pure element, becomes foul, unbreathable, when it has been long enclosed. Consider then what must be the foulness of the air of hell. Imagine some foul, putrid corpse that has lain rotting, decomposing in the grave, a jelly-like mass of liquid corruption. Imagine such a corpse, a prey to flames, devoured by the fire of burning brimstone, and giving off dense, choking fumes of nauseous, loathsome decomposition. And then, imagine this sickening stench, multiplied 1,000,000-fold and 1,000,000-fold again, from the millions upon millions of fetid carcasses massed together in a reeking darkness, a huge and rotting human fungus. Imagine all this, and you will have some idea of the horror of the stench of hell. And it continues. Like, damn. I won't keep going, though. And so this whole fire and brimstone sermon was so well done. It's not enjoyable by any means, but wow, was it effective. It's one of the few times during the story that you really understand how Stephen is feeling, because it's such a visceral reaction in the psyche. It's really good. Now, I couldn't help but notice how incredibly repetitive the analyses and reviews of this novel I encountered online were. Everyone either loves this novel and says very similar things about it, or they hate it and don't really offer a good reason why other than style. What I usually do after reading a novel is I sit with my thoughts about it for a while and reread anything I annotated to see if anything comes together further in my mind. And then I watch videos and read reviews on the novel to get a feel for what is most often spoken about so I can avoid the most common speaking points and try to bring something new and interesting to the discussion. But as I said, there are not many divergent opinions about this novel that I've come across. Has anyone else noticed this? Maybe it's just me stuck in a algorithmic hostage situation. Or maybe I'm just some idiot who didn't probe the internet deep enough. Highly likely. I didn't want this to just become another video lauding Joyce's genius. And there are a lot of those. And if you're looking for one of those, I highly recommend the CodeX Cantina's book summary, review, and analysis. It's one of the best I've found for really diving into the meat of this novel, and it explains the religious meanings well for those who might be coming to this book from a more secular perspective. For how long that video is, it gets right down to the nitty-gritty, meaty parts of the book very well. So I'll link it down below for anybody who's interested. Instead, what I want to do is talk about what to do when what is generally deemed as genius by the masses seems to be lost on you for the present. I've seen this devolve into comments of, "You just don't get it," or "It's you, not the material," as if not being as taken with a work is somehow a comment on the reader's intelligence. And I completely disagree. Just as Stephen must be honest with himself and stay strong against the persuasions to go along with something he does not believe to be true, to stay true to his aesthetic taste, so do you and me. And the question is not whether Joyce is a genius or not, because I think it's clear that he is. The question is instead whether this story appeals to your personal aesthetics. While I understand what is happening and the intention behind the story, for myself, I have to say it doesn't. And I'm going to tell you why. So let's cut to the chase already, okay? You've read the title of this video. Did I like this novel? Not really. Should that mean anything to you? I highly doubt it. This was a struggle bus read for me that registered about like a 6.5 to 7 on the Richter scale. It was bumpy. Wait a minute. Wait. Have I just discovered a new rating system for books? Now, I would highly recommend that you purchase an annotated edition of this novel because there is a lot of Irish slang, Latin phrases, and biblical passages that might fly under the radar for someone who is unaware or who isn't diligently Googling practically everything. My edition didn't have any annotations, so in that sense, I do not recommend it. This is the Penguin Edition drop caps collection of James Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, and I bought the whole collection, and so I didn't do any research as to this particular edition. So there's that. I don't recommend this edition. Because my edition didn't have any annotations, I think it impacted my first impression of this novel. And I really debated taking the time to acquire an annotated copy, reading it again, and writing my review of it then. But I chose not to, and here's why. Now, saying I didn't like this novel is not the same thing as saying I didn't understand it. Because I did. I mean, I'm sure I'm missing some of the Irishness of it, but overall, I got it. I didn't quite like it, but I could really appreciate what Joyce was doing here. This novel kind of felt like ADHD on steroids. One moment, Stephen is fixated on something, and then we're in the middle of a scene, and then he's thinking about one thing. We get brought back to the scene, and then he has another flashback. There was especially quite early on a scene when he's young where this happens, and it was a bit of whiplash. I'm not gonna lie. We're in his head, and it's very disorienting at times because we lose track of what's actually happening, where we are in the current timeline, what's going on. So, and the other interesting thing is I'm also dyslexic, so I tend to think in abstract, non-linear ways. So there were times where I had to reread sections many times to try to follow the very non-linear thread of the narrative Joyce was putting down. It literally felt like we were two Roombas set loose in a heavily furnitured house trying to find each other, just like I just had this like vision of two Roombas just kind of like trying to meet and then just never, like, just hitting everything and being redirected and never finding one another. That's what it felt like at times. But what I struggled with more than the style or the manner in which the storytelling unfolded, and what really made me in the end decide that this wasn't necessarily my taste, was that there was no real human relationships in this book. It was just Stephen in his own head. He's so lonely and isolated, but other than situations where he's bullied, we don't really see him ever have any strong feelings or connection with another human being. He is either an observer or a victim. We don't ever see him take action. All the actions he takes happen off-scene, and we are instead left to agonize over what he has done, how he reflects or longs for those things, or how ill he was treated. He has a friend here and there that he may relay a thought to, but it is nothing substantial. There's no realistic dialogue between him and a friend. Almost everyone, like 98% of the people in this novel, other than Stephen, is thoughtless, tasteless, cruel, or crude. Stephen seems better than all of them. It's just kind of convenient. Stephen reflects on his father being a poor example for him. He considers his father a weak and unreliable drunk who lives on the fumes of his glorious past, which is obviously a very young perspective. And he is young at the point that he thinks it. He thinks his father is a financial failure and is embarrassed by his need to change schools and by the family's move to a cheerless house. But honestly, he grew up with a governess and was in school and not expected to work to help provide for their large family, which would have been a very common thing at the time, as he is the eldest son. His schooling is a luxury he never really appreciates. He's one of at least 5 kids in the novel, as we don't really get a total number. And Joyce was the eldest of 10 children, where 5 others died before reaching adulthood. I mean, that means there were 15 children his mother would have had. 15! If I were his dad, I would be drinking a little bit too. At one point, Stephen is on a train with his dad because his father needs to sell the last of his property at auction. His father is drinking and weeping as he remembers better days and lost friends. But Stephen doesn't care about his father's feelings at all. He actually thinks his father is being melodramatic, which is the ultimate irony because they both think the other is way too sensitive, when in reality, each one is going through something, but they are completely inept at understanding one another. They got that in common. And later during this trip, Stephen is amazed to realize that he's not the only boy thinking profane thoughts all the time. I'm sorry, but that's a level of hilarious that's so poetic, and I'm sure it's exactly what Joyce was going for. Joyce is he's good. He did a really good job. I mean, I'm not a 14-year-old boy, but I feel like this only exemplifies how little Stephen actually talks or relates to any other boys, even his own brothers, and how he doesn't really have any friends. It would literally just take 3 seconds of talking to another boy to realize this is what everybody thinks. Because, it's not like they keep their thoughts inside too well, So it just shows that he doesn't really have any real friends. He feels his father is being melodramatic about his past and his sadness at needing to sell his land, but feels totally alienated because he's experienced what all boys do. I mean, I get he's young. I mean, honestly, we were all little assholes at some point. But damn, He doesn't even have it in him to comfort his father, who, even if he doesn't respect, he admits that he's a well-meaning man. His dad is not like the tyrant teachers he has experienced in school. This lack of empathy for anyone but himself really strikes me as Stephen being a privileged, self-centered child. Does he think for a moment that those prostitutes he got to enjoy are worried for their eternal soul, or living in a nice house, or experiencing their artistic truth or potential? No, there's no thought for those prostitutes or the poor people below his family's station. And then there's the moment that Stephen receives prize money for his winning essay, and he spends it in a frivolous way. He spends it on gifts for his family and decorations for the house, but also on prostitutes. He realizes that there is no escape from his situation, but this realization doesn't make him sympathetic to his father's money problems. Even though we see that his father is trying to do the best he can for his son and chooses schools based off of what Stephen's prospects will be after he graduates, Stephen judges his father when he's being honest with him, when he tells him he doesn't really know how to be a father. And this makes Stephen disassociate with his father further. When I saw this as a moment where his father was treating Stephen like an adult, but Stephen sees everything his father does, or everything he experiences, as mortifying. Everything is humiliating. God, I really don't miss being a teenager. Like, do you remember that time? Ugh. Joyce captures this myopic, self-centered, disinterest, reclusive obsession so perfectly. Like, amazing. So my major struggle with this novel has nothing to do with the actual style or the structure of the writing style or themes. My struggle was the complete lack of humanity and love when it comes to Stephen. And what I mean by this is he's never able to put himself in someone else's shoes. And this reminds me of the intellectual caste system in Siddhartha, where he can relate to animals and wind and water, but cannot understand his fellow man. And one can see this as a drawback to intellectualism. The intellectualism that leads to the abstraction and dehumanization of humanity. And perhaps one can argue that this wasn't the intention of a portrait of the artist as a young man, which is fair. But this also got me thinking about art and my ongoing struggle to find my own aesthetic point of view. I feel I need to read more modern and transgressive works of literature before I have a better understanding of the playing field in general. The playing field being a sort of Venn diagram or graphic mapping of aesthetics and morality versus art and entertainment. Now, I'm just a schmuck on the internet with no literary education. I'm just a weekend warrior over here trying to figure it out all for myself. So bear that in mind. But I pose the question, can or should art succeed if it doesn't even understand its fellow human? I can sympathize with Stephen's struggle and story, and so I appreciate it in that sense. But if the artist has no understanding of his fellow human, or have any love for them, then what are we reading and consuming? We get a self-indulgent, biased, one-sided type of paradox, don't we? We get a person who is alienated because he or she doesn't fit into society, but who cannot understand or connect with the people in the society. So is this society's fault, or is it the individual's? This feels very chicken and egg here. Which came first? The artist's rejection from society, or the artist's inability to think of anything but themselves, which prevents them from connecting with other people? It's like a Mobius strip of cause and effect, right? One cannot separate the two. And it feels like the onus is left upon the reader to do the heavy lifting to sympathize with the artist, when what the artist has done is put themselves out there for display. And that's no small thing. I'm not minimizing the courage it takes to do such a thing. But there can also be this idea that if one doesn't love a particular work of art, then that person is simply too unsophisticated to understand the message. But that's not true either. One could also argue that perhaps it is the artist that did not understand his fellow human either. It's a similar stalemate, right? It's an intriguing dilemma to me. I'm not saying there's a solution here. I'm just arguing that there are simply trade-offs, as I've said in other videos. There are pros and cons no matter where you stand on a scale. To assimilate into society, or to belong somewhere, be it politically, nationally, racially, religiously, or familially. To belong in at least one or a few of these areas did not mean one will belong to others. To belong is to sacrifice a bit of one's individuality, but the reward for that is companionship. To not belong anywhere is to embrace one's individuality at the cost of companionship. But I think there is hope in the struggle between the two positions, between belonging and individuality. Humans have this great potential inside themselves, and that potential is tapped when one wrestles with the battle between the two extremes of the spectrum. On one side is the fall into belonging, into the mob, and it is easy to see how one can lose oneself, one's individuality, for the trade-off of belonging, as we saw in Lord of the Flies. The neglecting of the inner potential and individuality. Often this is the path of least resistance, as there is no need to form your own opinions, for everyone else's opinion will do. And at the other end of the spectrum is the artist who submits to self-isolation to protect their individuality. All us introverts and creatives can idealize this stance. I mean, I know I have. But here it is easy to see the loneliness and isolation this brings to one's life. To belong nowhere, to be the constant outsider, but be able to do as one pleases. But this too neglects one's inner potential. This is also a similar path of least resistance because one does not need to constantly defend one's position or question one's belief. It is an echo chamber of one, bereft of the expanding potential of other perspectives and possible self-criticism and enlightenment. Joyce, in reality, eventually returned to Ireland because his mother was ill. She was dying, and while on her deathbed, pleaded for James to go to confession and receive communion, but he refused. And after she passed, he refused to kneel with his family by her bedside and pray with them. And this feels like a metaphor for this whole argument. This tragedy of life, or in this example, of his mother's death, where on one side his family invites him to join them, to belong, to comfort in this moment of tragedy. But James refuses to do what he does not believe. It's hard to know what to do in such a situation. I'm not saying Joyce should have caved. And the argument that the family should not have asked him to pray with them in the first place could also be seen as an act of exclusion. But it can also be seen as an act of coercion, just as Joyce's refusal can be seen to be more concerned with himself instead of everyone else's sorrow. Life is difficult. But love is also about concessions being made for one another, as I'm sure Joyce's mother made for him when he was a child, and he made for her as he came to her side to tend to her in her final months alive. Love finds a way. For me, this work lacked human connection and love. And how can the artist understand his world or his art without those things? I don't know. But that's what this book really made me stop and think about. And I think that's a good thing. This book is a snapshot of the artist before he becomes the artist, in my opinion. Thinking about a portrait of the artist as a young man really reminded me of another book. My Name is Asher Lev. There is a similar debate happening with religion and artistic expression and genius. Now, I'm not saying that these novels are the same aesthetic level, because they're not. I remember reading this in high school, and it really spoke to me at the time. Perhaps this book was my school's answer to some students' struggle with a portrait of the artist as a young man. Now, it's been a really long time since I've read this, and I've never read it since as an adult, so perhaps I would feel differently about it now. But I remember Asher Lev understanding the other people in his life, the artist's life, better. Understanding that while what his parents wanted for him was not what he wanted for himself, but that he understood their advice was coming from a place of love and concern. For anyone who struggled with a portrait of the artist as a young man, I definitely say don't give up on it. But you may also appreciate My Name is Asher Lev. I think one day I will get an annotated edition of this book and give it another go, as I want to read Ulysses one day. If anyone has edition recommendations for either book, let me know in the comments down below. I really respect Joyce's unique style, artistic choices, and deep internal monologue. And what has really changed my initial reaction to Joyce and his novel's detached self-centeredness was reading some of Joyce's letters he wrote to his wife and to friends. I'll drop a link in the description box if anyone else is interested in reading those too. The letters show a man who is anything but detached from humanity. They show a passionate man who understands his flaws and how his actions impact the people he loves. Which tells me that while in this novel we don't see Stephen find his balance between individuality and belonging, that the artist eventually finds it for himself. Art is not art unless it imitates life. But what did you think? Did you love this book? Did you hate it? Do you think it is the artist who should meet the reader on their terms, or that the reader must venture into the artist's? Let me know in the comments down below. Please like and subscribe so more people can join the conversation and find some great books. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.